The room was thick with anticipation, but not the eager kind. Faces, tight, bored, indifferent, glanced at their watches, papers shuffled, phones glimmered. I stood in a pool of stage light with my cello case behind me, palms sweating as I gripped the microphone. 40 investors, all with their own money and their own impossible dreams, watched me like hyenas eyeing a wounded calf. I'd rehearsed my pitch 1,000 times. I believed every word with the kind of burning conviction that scorches the soul. My proposal was simple: a center in São Paulo for classical musicians, youth from the poorest bairros, prodigies hidden in favelas, a place for them to practice, perform, and grow. Imagine Villalobos reborn, I had written on my slides. Nobody cared. The suits in the front row smirked. One exchanged a look of disbelief with the elegantly dressed woman beside him. "This is Brazil, señorita," someone called out, voice floating up from the dim seats. "Kind of a waste, isn't it?" I faltered, my face flushed as I tried, stubbornly, heartbreakingly, to explain. Music transforms lives. This is an investment in people. It's... A man in the back coughed theatrically. The host cut me off. "Thank you, Isadora, we'll be in touch." The polite lie rang in the echo of my footsteps as I walked off stage, my cello bumping heavy against my side. Backstage, I caught a glimpse of myself in a streaked mirror. My hair had come loose, cheeks were blotchy, eyes red. The faces of my family flickered in my mind, my mother circling job ads in the paper. My father muttering about real work and how São Paulo eats dreamers for breakfast. My younger brother watching me with wary admiration edged with pity. Something inside me, long held together by hope, came apart. Anger flared at them, at the room, at this city, at myself, and yet underneath it a hard kernel of serenity. I gathered my things and walked into the street. It had rained earlier, the city shimmering, car lights casting yellow rivers along wet pavement. I walked until my feet ached, cello cutting at my shoulder, breathing each uneven breath with careful defiance. But the next morning I got up. I played as I always had. If you ask me how I kept going, I can't give you a clean answer. Sometimes it was rage, sometimes a quiet, relentless voice that said, "Try again." What nobody saw was the real fight, in practice rooms that smelled of old wood and resin, nights alone with tangled sheet music, hunger that made my fingers tremble. I took gigs in restaurants, funerals, weddings, anyone that would pay enough for a meal or a month's rent. Every time I called my mother, she asked if I'd heard from the banco again, or said, "Issa, maybe it's time to get serious about your path." My father had mostly stopped talking, except to ask if I still remembered how to use a screwdriver. But music was the only language I truly understood. 10 years slid by, marked in cracked calluses and the pages of dog-eared scores. Somehow, I found myself in Vienna. A friend from the conservatoire had a friend. People opened doors for me, sometimes by accident. I clawed my way in. The first season, I lived in a closet under a staircase in a stranger's flat, practiced silently at night. Eventually, I played with orchestras, then as a soloist. The world was bigger, colder, more musical than I'd dreamed. Sometimes, after a concert, a stranger would catch my hand and say, "Why schön?" or simply weep. In those moments, that hard serenity inside me swelled to fill every room. Success is never a thunderclap. It's a slow gathering of rain, and you only realize you're soaked through when you notice how heavy your coat is. One summer afternoon, 10 years after that flopped investor night, I received an email. Someone in São Paulo, the Fundação, invited me to headline the reopening of the Teatro Municipal, newly restored, with a full orchestra and a gala to follow. It would be broadcast nationwide. They wanted to celebrate alumni who honor Brazil abroad. I read the email 3 times, pulse galloping. I agreed, feeling light and brittle in my bones. Returning to São Paulo after so many years was like wading into a dream, familiar but warped by time. Palm trees lining Avenida Paulista shimmered, and the sun was heavy and close. The air tasted like wet earth and grilled meat. I checked into a modest hotel near the city center, not the kind international soloists usually chose, but close to the action, close to the chaos of my childhood. I called my mother first. "Oi me," I said, nerves jangling. There was a pause. "Isadora, meu Deus, I saw your name in the papers. Everyone is talking." Her voice was higher than I remembered, thinner. "I'll be playing at the Municipal," I told her. I waited, expecting silence, but she laughed, soft and astonished. "My girl on that stage," she said. I heard the tears in her voice, old resentments dissolving like sugar in coffee. "Will you come?" I asked, holding my breath. A pause, then, "Of course, Issa." My father was next. The line buzzed, and when he answered, I imagined him in his garage workshop, smelling of oil and sweat. "Oi, pai. Isadora." Your mother already told me. I'd like you to be theirs. A grunt if it's important to you, the rest went unsaid, but it didn't matter, I knew they'd come. Word spread through the streets of our old bairro. Suddenly, the neighbors who'd once whispered, "Poor girl with her fantasies," or "imagine," thinking she can be a star, started posting on social media, boasting that they'd known me back when I practiced in the courtyard or borrowed bus fare to get to lessons. Even my brother, who'd long ago joined a tech startup, messaged me, "Proud of you, Issa, tickets for 4, right?" The day of the concert broke hot and clear. I barely slept that night. I watched the sky fade from black to steel blue, ran scales on my cello for hours, fingers dancing sure and calm, technique burned into them by years of stubborn practice. At noon, I walked the route from my hotel to the Teatro Municipal. The city pulsed with the sticky heat of summer, vendors hollering, music blaring from taxi radios, the air filling with the smell of churros and diesel. I reached the theatre early, standing before its ornate facade with its marble columns and gilded balcony, the steps gleaming like a stage for gods. I remembered the first time my father brought us here, standing far away, saying, "People like us don't go inside." I'd pressed my face against the gates, dreaming of velvet curtains and thunderous applause. Inside, it was dark and cool. The rehearsal was quiet, the orchestra ran through the most complex passages, strings swelling, woodwinds fluttering in anticipation. I walked on stage alone to tune, sliding the bow across the strings. Every sound echoed up into the high dome, reverberating in gold leaf and crystal. I pictured the auditorium full, every seat, every eye on me. Backstage, technicians paced. Someone handed me a modest bouquet, and I smiled out of habit. My hands trembled as performance adrenaline began its slow crawl up my spine. When the time arrived, the auditorium was bursting. I scanned the first rows, finding them, my parents sitting impossibly stiff, my brother with his new wife and child. Fray Paulo, the priest who'd once told my mother that music was frivolous, sat 2 seats away. Dona Luz, who'd snickered when I scraped chords as a child, perched beside her daughter. It all felt impossibly unreal. The stage director touched my shoulder. "Pronto." "Pronto," I lied. But then the house lights dimmed, the hush swept through the audience, and I walked into the light, cello in hand. For a breathless moment, the world shrank to the shape of my instrument. I drew the bow. The opening notes of Villa-Lobos' suite swirled from my fingertips, warm, rich, impossible. It felt less like I was playing and more like I was translating the nature of my own longing, hope, fury, calm. The room pulsed with attention, audience leaning, hearts beating in tandem with every swell and hush. Halfway through, sweat beaded at my brow, my anger melting into something crystalline. Every time I'd played alone, unheard and unappreciated, now had a purpose. The years of skepticism, family mutterings, neighborhood jeers, they fed the performance, burned it into something magnificent. As the last note faded, I stared into the darkness, chest heaving, and then silence. For an instant, I thought they hadn't understood, that I'd failed, that all of this was just a beautiful, cruel mirage. Then applause erupted, violent, unrestrained, like a storm breaking over glass. People stood, programs fluttered like white wings. I trembled, bowing once, twice, then again. I saw my mother standing, hands clutched to her mouth, eyes shining. My father, face impassive, but his hands moving soundlessly, clapping. My brother and his family screamed up at me. Even Dona Luz blinked away tears. After the curtain fell, I slipped away to a quiet hallway, breath shallow, every muscle shivering with spent energy. The air was tinged with the old wood and dust, and a faint whiff of rosin on my hands. My serenity had never felt so full, rooted in something so impossibly solid. The after-party churned with politicians, critics, musicians, all vying for a moment of conversation. For the first hour, I clung to my wine glass, nodding through congratulations, my eyes darting toward the door where I'd asked my family to meet me. When they arrived, my mother's hair was pinned with silver, my father's shirt neatly pressed, my brother still carrying the restlessness of youth despite the lines forming beneath his eyes. My niece stared up at me like I was a superhero. My mother hugged me, wordless, thin hands shaking. My father didn't hug, but he put his rough palm on my shoulder and gave it a careful squeeze. "Didn't think you'd ever get here," he said, voice low, "but you did, you really did." I let the anger drain away, replaced by a calm so profound it made me want to weep. Friends and old acquaintances crowded in later, skeptical eyebrows having migrated upward in disbelief. Even Fray Paulo shook my hand, whispering "Talento menina, perdao pilo que dice antes." I only smiled. But the most powerful moment came later, at a quiet reception in a hall just off the stage. The room was filled with Sao Paulo's cultural elite, but also the very people who'd laughed or rolled their eyes at my ridiculous ambition, for, as my dream had outgrown even me, the talk of Isadora, the cellist who made it, had become irresistible gossip. I waited until the fuss had faded, then asked for everyone's attention. "I want to share something," I said, voice clear but trembling. "Thank you for believing in me, even those who didn't, because you made me work harder." Laughter, uncertain but warm. But tonight isn't the end. With the backing from the Fundação and other organizations, I nodded toward the sponsors, I will open a music center here in Sao Paulo. A place for students like I once was, who just need a chance. Along the back, I saw skeptical faces harden, and then, as I gestured to the plans, the architectural renderings, the endorsements, the startup funds, they wilted with recognition. "We've already secured the building and scholarships will be available for anyone, regardless of means," I finished. A hush fell. It was not the applause from earlier but something weightier. The realization that proof stood not only in notes or applause but in the concrete, irrefutable evidence of real physical success. The same people who had snickered, who'd rolled their eyes, were silent now, faced with blueprints and contracts and a future they'd never believed could be real. I caught my mother's gaze across the room. She was crying openly, pride and regret and relief written in every line of her face. Later that night, I left the theatre alone. The city was alive, humming, indifferent to my triumph as it had been to my struggles, but I belonged to it again more deeply than I ever had. As I walked, I could hear music in distant windows, the clang of trams, laughter, dogs barking, life folding in on itself. The anger, once molten and bright, now cooled to something stronger, resolve paired with peace. I made one last stop before morning, standing at the empty lot where my center would rise. It was just a patch of cracked asphalt covered in weeds, the shadow of future walls sketched only in my mind and in the carefully signed documents in my bag. But I could see the rehearsal rooms, the students with shining eyes, the pulse and promise of beginnings. Sao Paulo didn't care that I was back, not really, but it would soon. I ran my hand along the chain-link fence, remembered that girl pressing her nose against the gates of a world supposedly closed to her. I smiled, warm, new, real. When I returned home, I didn't bring a trophy or even the concert's program, just the music still vibrating through my veins and the certainty that I had made myself, note by note. And in the silence that followed, I felt whole.